you know, that because this is happening now and because people are becoming so hyper aware of what's happening, that we'll have a better chance of affecting that change because there's so many more people that are on the same page, that we will become a force to be reckoned with. I just did an interview with some folks doing a CBC documentary yesterday, and we were talking about that. You know, it's okay to feel a little bit sad or a little bit worried that we're behind time, or we were ignorant back then. But the more people that we have in our corner, the more people we have standing shoulder to shoulder, is when you can affect change the best. And doing it in a united way is so important. So I thank you. Sorry, I can't remember the name of your organization for creating this. And it looks like you have a lot of people online here today. And yeah, so hi, EJECKAM, thanking all of you, and I wish you all the best today.
Thank you so much, Carleen. Your words are so profound and meaningful at this time. And as always, we know that our work within this organization, but in the wider public education system, has to be done within the leadership of Indigenous communities. We have much to learn and we have much to do as we move forward. And I'm always brought back to the idea that we should bound ourselves in humility. So thank you so much for your words. And we are so happy that you were able to join us today. We hope you could stay for the rest of the talk. Before I turn it over to our wonderful moderator to take over the interview today, I would like to say that if you have any questions for our panelists, please send them. You can email them to myself or Corrine Ng, and I've put that in the chat box. You can also put your questions in the chat box, and we'll be regularly monitoring them and taking them and providing them to the moderator. So I would like to introduce Preet Litter. Preet Litter is a Vancouver school teacher. She is a teacher in math and science, secondary math and science. As well, we had the pleasure of meeting when we were both completing our master's in equity studies in education at Simon Fraser. Preet's work in the master's program focused on racial justice, specifically looking at the effects and impacts of policing in our school communities on racialized students and racialized colleagues. Her work is profound, not just in her ability to do academic work, but also in what she does in community activism. I know being a AOEC member with her and executive member with her and the other many capacities that I have the pleasure of working alongside her, that her understanding of the layers of oppression and how they function in our society gives us the trajectory to eradicate them. So I'm very excited to introduce you all to Preet Litter and let her take it away. Thank you.
Thank you, Shani. That was a very generous introduction. Good morning, everybody. I want to begin by acknowledging that I'm currently on the unceded territories of Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh Coast Salish peoples, and my pronouns are she and her. I am deeply humbled and honored to be moderating today's phenomenal panel. It was organized very quickly. There are hundreds of people tuning in today, which is a real testament to the urgency that many folks are feeling to engage in racial justice. The murder of George Floyd by Minneapolis police and the several murders that have occurred before and after, not only for Black men, but for Black women, for Black trans folks, for Indigenous folks, have driven hundreds of thousands of people into the streets across the globe, and the rallying cry of Black Lives Matter is ringing loudly from coast to coast. It's also illuminating the bigger picture, which is how social institutions, in particular the education system, dominated historically and intellectually by white supremacy, creates the very conditions in which Floyd's life is snatched violently and with impunity before our very own eyes. As a non-Black woman of color, my role here is to facilitate this discussion and provide a space that elevates the voices and expertise of our panelists, so we can follow their lead on the ongoing process of uncovering, critiquing, and ultimately dismantling anti-Black racism in our school communities. I know that many of you have already read the profiles of our three panelists, or you may already be familiar with their work, but I would like for them to take a few minutes to introduce themselves. So I would like for them to talk about who they are and what brought them here today to speak on a panel about anti-Black racism in schools. So not in any particular order, let's start with CHUKA EJECKAM. CHUKA is the Director of Research and Policy at the BC Federation of Labor and a research associate with the BC Office of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. Over to you, CHUKA.
Thank you, Preet. I'm speaking from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples as well, and my pronouns are he and him. So I am, as Preet mentioned, a labor researcher and policy analyst and a research associate with the CCPA. I am also myself a master's student in political science at the University of British Columbia. When Shani approached me about this opportunity, there were sort of two reasons that I wanted to participate. And the first is that I believe that education has an impact on how we view, understand, and interact with the world. And so ideally, I feel that education will give us a sort of historically grounded and contextualized and materialist understanding of how the world came to be as it is, the sort of structures that have the impulses and structures that have shaped it over recent centuries, where those structures came from, the purposes that they've served, and the enduring impacts that they continue to have, and the legacies of those structures. And again, how all of those shape the world in which we inhabit. Now, I think if our education fails to give us that sort of historically grounded and materialist understanding of how things came to be as they are, then we put students, and particularly young people, into a very precarious position, because human beings are naturally pattern seeking. And so if we look around the world and we lack that historical materialist context, then we will attempt to understand it through the patterns that we identify, and then we will generate a reason for its existence in its present form based on the patterns that we identify. And so my concern, and perhaps my fear, is that if someone, a young person, were to look around the world and see, for example, a pattern in which Black people face inequities nearly everywhere, internationally, nationally, then they may generate a reason for that is fundamentally a racist or a white supremacist reason. And so lacking that historical grounding, I think, impairs or significantly hinders the ability that people have to understand the world in a meaningful way that does not propagate the very systems that have brought it to the point that it is, and also reduces their ability to sort of connect to the struggles that are attempting to unearth and eradicate those structures, as Shani had identified. The other reason, I think, is that so both intangibly, I think that education also has an immense impact on how we come to view, understand, and interact with ourselves. And this, of course, is more sort of inward looking than the other reason, but I think it is as important, particularly for Black students, for example. I think that the social experience of education can have fundamental impacts on their relationship with themselves, and those experiences, particularly early in life, influence their later experiences in life, how they navigate the world, how their relationship with themselves, the sort of positive and negative qualities of it, the person that they feel they are able to create themselves into as they get older, the relationships that they're able to form, the character of those relationships, how they can sort of how they can exist within them. And all of these, of course, can have incredibly pernicious impacts for how someone goes through their life. And so I think in both of these cases, lacking that historical context and lacking an understanding of how these systems have came to structure the world in a material sense, but also how they've came to structure the world in a social sense, and how they can inform social experiences that people that are kind of reproduced, even if the people who are reproducing those experiences don't understand that they're doing so, don't understand that they're propagating these centuries-long systems. Then I think that is I think it's incredibly harmful, and I think it makes it much more difficult to attempt to actually change what's occurring. So a sort of very kind of direct example of this thing that I'm talking about in the second sense, the sort of intangible social experience sense, is that a very old principle of the European Enlightenment, of white supremacy, is that Black people are lesser intelligent. Now, that can be propagated by children in a notion that they expect Black people, whether it's other Black students or Black people in general, to be less intelligent, to do more poorly in schools, in school and academic achievements, to act in certain ways, sort of conduct themselves in certain ways. Now, they can impose those beliefs onto Black students that they are in class with or in school with without recognizing that they're doing that, right? They're just sort of reproducing things that they've inculcated without the knowledge that they've inculcated these things and are reproducing them. But then that imposition of those expectations influences the Black students who are faced with it, as well as influences, teachers who will encourage Black students to take to pursue educational streams that aren't as academic, that don't sort of point toward graduate school or doctorates or academia in the long sense, and without making a sort of moral or value judgment about various types of education, that is still a structuring force that can have significant harmful consequences. So those are the two reasons that I wanted to participate in this conversation.
Thank you, Chuka. Next, we have Ruby Smith-Diaz, who is a multidisciplinary artist, youth facilitator, personal trainer, and the founder of Tierra Negra Arts and Autonomy Personal Training. Good morning to you, Ruby.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. Buenos dias. My name is Ruby, and my pronouns are she, her, and hers. I'm currently joining you all from the Treaty 6 territories, which are the traditional homelands of the Blackfoot, the Dene, the Cree, Métis, Saulteaux, Stoney Nakoda, and more specifically, the gathering place of the Papas-Chase people and the traditional homelands of the Papas-Chase people as well. Generally, I reside in the unceded territories of the Tsleil-Waututh, Musqueam, and Squamish people. I'm an Afro-Latina person, so my lineage comes from very different parts of the world. Through my dad's lineage, I come from Jamaica, Arab, Carib, and Arawak territories. And we have Maroon ancestry through that side. And on my mom's side, we come from Chile, from the territory known as Waimapu, and from Spanish heritage and ancestry from that side. So what I know of the area, and I wanted to share this with you because in my unlearning, mostly unschooling, I've been learning about talking about myself as a way to acknowledge the territories that places me in this place. And what I know of the treaties that were signed here, specifically on Treaty 6, is that they were signed in states of duress, where the Canadian government had active campaigns to starve out Indigenous communities by withholding food in warehouses and slaughtering food sources that communities relied on. And what I also know about treaties, what I've come to know about them, is that treaties are made from a nation-to-nation perspective. They were only made, international treaties, between sovereign nations. And the fact that Canada has signed treaties means that we must also recognize the fundamental fact that the nations here have been here since time immemorial. And it also means that for myself, as an Afro-Latina person born on these territories, that there are certain responsibilities that I have as a settler person within these nation-to-nation treaties. And so part of my work also involves learning these histories that have been hidden and erased in the Canadian curriculum. And it also has meant learning more about where I come from and how I have come to arrive to this place and to the places that I work and reside on. So I grew up specifically here in South Edmonton, and growing up here predominantly in a white neighborhood, as a poor person coming from a poor family, my experiences going through school and often being the only person that was Black has greatly informed the work I do today. My experiences growing up weren't the most positive, and some of those things you don't really realize how much you take in and how much othering that there is within the education system until you're an adult, which to me happened around age 21, but I didn't realize how much my identity had been erased through the educational system. I didn't realize how much violence that I had to experience that was never spoken up for by teachers, by peers, by anyone within the education system, that I actually had to just take and put down until I was an older person. And I see that happening a lot with our young people now. And that has really driven me to work in the field that I do. So it really pushed me to get into the field of education and to understand why the education systems are structured in the way that they are. So I graduated from the University of Alberta with a Bachelor's of Education with distinction, specializing in social studies and Spanish. And I've been dedicating my work to working with youth outside of school environments through means of popular education and arts-based education. My work also involves anti-oppression workshops. So I work with organizations and other community groups to also deliver this kind of information that will hopefully let them look inwards on themselves about the work that they need to do, and also take tangible actions to repair harm within themselves, within their relations, and their communities. Back in 2016, I founded Tierra Negra Arts, as Preet mentioned. And as of more recently, I have chosen to dedicate a lot of my work to work within schools because I saw such a huge need to be working with young people. I saw such a huge gap, not only in the Alberta curriculum, but in the BC curriculum, an absence of our histories. And I was also seeing the effect that this was having on young people where, you know, they were asking me, how come you know all these things and I don't? How come you know all of this information and I can't seem to find it? And all of this information I had to learn myself. And I have to tell you, it is such a disorienting experience to not know who you are, to not have any kind of your history represented within the educational system. Couple this with the violence, the heightened violence that we've been seeing against the Black communities, the murders of Black individuals that have been publicly televised, and where we see murders of these people get away without any consequence. Also breaks my heart to see what youth have to experience, what youth have to see vicariously and understand that that could have been them. And so what that did was it pushed me to launch Still Here, which is an arts-based curriculum. It's a 7-part workshop series that explores Black histories and futures and what we know in so-called Canada. And specifically, that curriculum covers the work that Black communities have done to resist. It covers also the erasure that has happened of Black histories locally and also in other places in so-called Canada. And what it does is it allows students the opportunity to explore their own histories and their own identities and understand how we have arrived to this place, but also understanding how the erasure of Indigenous communities, how the erasure of Black communities, how those interrelated communities has led to us kind of forgetting where we come from and what this nation really is. And so my work there is to allow students the opportunity to deeply connect with that history and also mobilize around that, to understand that education is one part, but also taking action is a significant part of it, and also allowing Black students in particular the possibility to imagine their own futures, to imagine their own futures from a place of empowerment and self-determination is critical within the work as well, because so much of that power has been taken away from us for hundreds and hundreds of years, since the time where, you know, the Papal Bull was set in motion back in the 1400s. And so that's a little bit of the work that I wanted to share with you, and I hope to continue to share a little bit more about myself and my perspectives later on today. Thank you for organizing and for putting together this panel.
Thank you, Ruby. We are so excited for you to be here. Finally, I have JOANN ANOKWURU. She's the Principal Consulting Officer for Newland Educational Services, Nigeria, where she acts as a voice for children with disabilities. She's also a resource teacher here in Vancouver, where she presently teaches in the district program called Gateway to Adulthood. Welcome, JOANN.
Hi, thank you, Preet. I'm glad to be here, and I want to really acknowledge that I live and work and learn on this unceded territories of the Coast Salish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam people. And I really want to appreciate you for giving me this opportunity to be part of this land, to be part of this forum. And I'm going to start today with sharing a quote from Walter Jane Williams. I am not afraid of werewolves or vampires or haunted hotels. I am afraid of what real human beings do to real human beings. And then who am I? I had to write this when all of these things started happening. And I noticed what was going on globally because I come from Nigeria where we're all Blacks. We don't really go through this racism or anti racism. But being a special needs teacher and an inclusive educator, something I really experienced was the stigma towards kids with disabilities. And now coming here and seeing that intersectionality where people with disabilities are also separated in Nigeria. And now, being Black, there's this distinct. I'm able to see my color. I sort of see my color. So I had to write this poem. I find healing in poetry. Who am I? What do you see? A woman, a person of color, a mother, an educated individual, an inclusive educator, an outspoken individual, a graduate. All this and more, subdued by society, marginalized by culture, erased by history, tainted by the other, held down by the strong. If only you could see beyond the color, you will not hold me down. If only you can hear the voice of my inner being crying to be free, you will not hold me down. If only you can see the sparkle in my eye, you will not blindfold me. I crowd for justice. I scream out to be free. Enough is enough. Let me breathe. Let me rise to a new dawn. Do not hold me down. And the reason why I'm excited to be part of this panel, to be part of this forum, and why did I decide to take up this space to be here? As a mother of two children, one of a young adult, unassuming adult who was racialized, profiled by educators in his high school, and my daughter who constantly worries about, Mommy, am I going to go into the same high school as my brother? Do I really need to go to school? Won't I be racialized? Won't I be traumatized? She saw the trauma her brother went through for years. Depression, he actually got to a point of being depressed that we had to spend time, you know, going to psychologists, financial commitment, prayers, all of that. But he was taunted and haunted by educators who were supposed to protect him. And he kept on saying, Mommy, what is it wrong about me? Why is it different? What makes me different from the other person? And I keep telling him, I said, sweetheart, there's nothing wrong with you except that you're a Black boy. You'll be treated differently in this land, you know, because of the systematic racism ingrained in people. While any other child commits the same offense you do, but because you're Black, you'll be separated, you'll be taken off and given a different treatment. And then my children keep asking me daily. They asked me yesterday, Mommy, but why? Why do they keep giving us different treatment? I still tell them all the time, you are Black, you're a criminal, you're a thug. That's what they see. You're not supposed to attain any form of education. You're supposed to be incarcerated because they don't want you. They don't believe you need to be educated. Somebody calls you the N word and walks away with it because they expect you to turn the other cheek and say, yes, slap me and call me another word. Recently, I had to buy this book, The Hate You Give by Angie Thomas, for my kids, for them to read. I am daily, again as a mother, inundated with questions from my children. Mommy, what is wrong with my color? Why can't people see beyond my color? Why do the other people hate brown and Black people so much? And I tell them, do not be deceived by the smiles or connections around you. When the chips are down, these are the same people that will walk away from you. They will deny you every sort of help. They will racialize you and put you in prison. Thank you. And I'm glad to be here to listen to your questions and provide solutions on how we can support Black children in our school system. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanne. Thank you for that beautiful introduction. And to all three of our panelists, folks may not know this, but these three folks jumped on just a week ago. So this has been a very, very fast, rapid organization. And so we're really, really humbled and excited that they were able to come here on a Saturday morning and be with us. Let's begin with our Q&A. Actually, it really it leans into something that Joanne was already alluding to, and I believe actually all of our panelists was. And I want to take a few moments to just sort of tease apart some language here and some frameworks. So really the distinction between racial identity, that is the notion of being Black, right, and as an ascribed identity, because we know, of course, race is a social construct, but it is created and given meaning by social interactions and interpretations within society and institutions like schools. And then racialized identity, the act of sort of becoming Black. In other words, a politicized understanding. So I want to take a moment here and talk about what both CHUKA and JOANN spoke about, which is the racialization, right? This process that we, this term that's used and has been used by decades by critical race theorists, but I don't know if we're always really grounded in understanding what that means. So racialization, the act of assigning specific meanings to groups of people, physical differences. So my question, and I'll start with CHUKA, in terms of describe the ways in which schools have and continue to wield a tremendous amount in the power of, in the racialization of Black students. So I'll start with CHUKA first.
Thank you. So I think there's kind of two processes by which this happens, which are again related to sort of a kind of material process and a non-material process. And so the non-material one is a process of socialization. So I think that in schools, of course, schools are like very important social circumstances for young people. It's, you know, where a significant amount of their social interactions come from, particularly social interactions that are not like kind of selected or not selected by their guardians or caregivers or what have you, or not independently selected. So you're, you know, exposed to a number of different people and different perspectives and things like that. People with distinct experiences from yourself. But so in that, but in the same sense, there are still overriding sort of social conceptions that are often prevailing or predominant. And so I think in schools, young people young Black students can like experience those social conceptions of Black identity, right? Those sort of racialized understandings of what Blackness is that are related to these same structures that have dehumanized Black people for centuries, that have subjugated and exploited and brutalized them. And so in being sort of held to that, or in having that process of racialization imposed upon them, they can, I think it influences how they you know sort of understand themselves. But even if it's not something as kind of internal or fundamental as how one understands yourself, it is still, you know, being a young person in the social environment, you want to not have a perpetually unpleasant experience. And so if people are basically harassing you for not conforming to their ideas of what it is to be Black, then that is something that you either have to endure or sort of attempt to avoid by effectively kind of performing what their expectations are. And so this can mean a number of different things, but it can you know place students at risk of being criminalized or being expelled or suspended. It can cause them to withdraw from academic pursuits because, you know, it was made explicit during the Enlightenment and the institutionalization of scientific racism, but it is still an implicit belief that intelligence is predominantly a white trait, or at least not predominantly not a characteristic that Black people possess or not expected to possess. You know, Black students can be called white if they do well in school, and sort of in a perverse reality is that they're often called white by white students. But this, you know, this process of racialization, it can inform in many ways the experiences that young people have. And I think Ruby spoke very, you know, eloquently about this. And all of that is something that young Black students will have to navigate before I think they can be expected to actually understand what's occurring. Like, this is something that, looking back on my experiences in elementary school, junior high, and high school, I can understand where these things came from. But at the time, my impulse was to avoid them. And if I can speak frankly, like, I almost dropped out of school. I almost dropped out of high school for reasons related to this kind of harassment. And so it is, I think, incredibly affecting, and it can be incredibly harmful to Black students who are kind of attempting to just to navigate these sorts of social expectations, to experience this process of racialization in a way that isn't perpetually painful, without necessarily being able to recognize that that's what's occurring or where it comes from. And then in the material sense, which is more related to what is taught in schools, I think the same things can occur, but they can occur with the sort of veneer of credibility, or the veneer of authority, which is of course very dangerous. So, for example, when young people are taught history, often it is a very Eurocentric history, and centering European history in the teaching of history is effectively centering Europeans in the construction of the world, in the telling of history that is relevant and that is important and that is worth knowing. By centering European history, we center Europeans in the construction of, and leadership really of the world. We're implicitly saying that European society is the prevailing society in the world. It is the predominant and rightfully predominant society in the world, and that the outcomes of European society are sort of noteworthy or laudable and are more important than anything else. Of course, and even when, for example, the European colonization or the Atlantic slave trade is taught, it's kind of taught as a regrettable period in history, rather than an era of structuring that informs the world that we live in, that produced sort of structural legacies that are continually animated by the institutions that exist today, and that have an incredible amount of influence over not just not just in the grand scale how the world is, but an incredible amount of influence over our day-to-day interactions and the things that we are forced to navigate as we move through the world. And so I think that whether it's teaching the Enlightenment, as uncritically teaching the Enlightenment as a sort of period of revolutionary thought, or it's teaching European history as central and most important. Many of these things can sort of place European society, most specifically white men, as the kind of vanguards of the species, in a way that implicitly dehumanizes everybody else, and perhaps most directly dehumanizes Black people. And so again, things can be, young students can inculcate these things from these sorts of lessons without necessarily recognizing that they're doing so. And it may not be until much later, later in life, that you can look back and recognize what has occurred. But by then, you've gone through the process of maturing. You've made yourself into a person, and you have sort of taken in and adopted and begun to experience and sort of you've created yourself in a way, whether intentionally or not, that allows you to move through the world with perhaps as little pain as possible. And that might mean performing to other people's expectations. It might mean just like choosing not to recognize or not directly assail all of these structures that dehumanize you. Or it might mean kind of just accepting things, implicitly accepting things in a way that makes them less arduous. But all of these things are incredibly impactful, especially in people's youth and adolescence. And by the time you can look back and consider them, so much has already happened, and there's so many things that you've had to do or continually to do, that now you have to attempt to kind of reconsider and potentially work through. So I think that, in both that sort of material process that's related to the things that are taught, and the non-material one that's about the social experience, can be incredibly affecting.
Thank you so much, Chuka. I especially like towards the end, you're talking about not only how schools and school structures actively racialize Black students in the construction of the identity, but also how Black students can subvert and challenge that power as well and resist. So that's a really important piece in that racialization of being empowered and taking on that racialized identity and sort of speaking back to the system and speaking back to schooling. So I'm going to pass the mic on to JOANN under the same question about the racialization process in schools. Thank you.
That's thank you, Chuka. You've just hit the nail on the head. But again, I'm troubled. You know, you made a statement about, you know, you go through this experience and some kids are able to look back and overcome it. What about kids who can't? What about kids who struggle with it? And we end up, I mean, we hear so much, there's so much research now around social emotional learning, your well-being, care for self, you know, take time to breathe, mindfulness, you know, but then inside of you, you've internalized, you've been excluded, you've been racialized, you've been looked at as someone who can't, who can't achieve anything in life. How do you deal with such a situation? I'm so fortunate to have taken my son. I saw that. I lived it for 2 years. I took my son through psychologists. How many parents can do that? How many people can go through that space? Because then you end up hearing a child has committed suicide. A child starts fighting back and they fight back aggressively. And then they end up being in prison or they go out killing people. So you see, all this racialization that we find in schools has negative effects. And it takes a lot for a child to be able to say, you know what, I mean, Chuka, you said you almost dropped out, but you overcame. I'm sure things around your environment helped you overcome such a situation, like I'm doing with my kid, like I'm doing with some other kids. Same thing, even in my space where I work with kids with disabilities in Nigeria, where, I mean, I've been doing this for years as an advocate, being a voice. And I've had to tell parents, you know what, your child has a space in this world. And the parents, because the parents see that there's someone there who's giving them a voice. How many of our kids, Black kids, have someone that they can look up to, that can be their mentor, that can be their voice? There's one thing about you being submerged in a system that tells you you're nothing. And then you looking onto the other side, to the north, to the south, to the east, to west, to say, yes, I have someone that I can talk to. Let's look at the statistics. I'm sure there are quite a number of Black kids out there in our school systems, in our school communities who have dropped out of school, who've lost it. But what can we do? How can we stop this racialization in schools? How can we develop, if I have to use, is it Angela Duxford, how can we develop a growth mindset? Take ourselves, I mean, step back, take a deep breath. I know it's difficult because systems, who forms a system, as I would say? Even though the systems have laws and policies, but who propagates those laws? It's us, it's you and I. But if you decide to become an ally with me and with all these kids and say, you know what, I refuse to follow the laws. I'm going to make a drastic change. I'm going to pick the next Black kid on my hallway and provide support, but not support in a patronizing way, but support knowing where their lived experience, where they've come from. Because in school, we have lived experience and we have lived curriculum and we have planned curriculum and we have the hidden curriculum. I mean, I remember my son going in the first day into school here, and because we come from a culture where you don't look eyeball to someone who's older than you, and the person telling my son, will you raise up your head? That alone shook me. I quickly left home. I left the office and I called my mom, who is also an educator back home, to say, Mommy, I think I'm in the wrong space, Mommy. Because my son has just been told to, like, his first day in school, he was just told, you know what, look me in the eyeball. This is a child who's been taught not to look. I mean, cultures, we need to understand where they're coming from. Our culture does not allow younger kids to look face to face into you. And that's why if you have some Black kids in your school and you're talking and they don't look up, think of their culture, think of where they've come from. It's not that they've been submerged, it's not that they've been subdued, it's out of respect. Thank you.
Thank you so much, JOANN. I appreciate what you're talking about in terms of the sort of pain and trauma and just the act of resisting the racialization that's occurring at schools. I love this quote by Ibram X. Kendi, who said, by asking every non-athletic Black person to become an Olympic hurdler and then blaming them when they can't keep up is racist, right? So one of racism's harm is the way it falls on to be the exceptional Black person, Black student who is asked to be extraordinary just to survive. So that just brought that up for me as you were speaking. Actually, I think that what you two have been speaking to really leans really nicely into my next question, which is how do schools, and I'm gonna pose this to Ruby and then back to JOANN, which is how do schools fail to center Black contributions, histories, voices, and narratives across curricula and pedagogy? And a couple sort of questions embedded in that is how can we then teach? So the other side of it, so here are the problems, right? And then how can we teach so that it affirms the existence and humanity of Black communities? And what would be a more liberatory educational space for Black children and youth look like? Because we have educators here, hundreds, that are really grappling with this idea of how do we actually create those spaces? So I'm gonna move this first to Ruby.
Thank you so much, and thank you, JOANN and CHUKA, for laying that out. I just wanted to connect something to JOANN's last point as well. It was just an experience that I had in school as well, of having bullying get to the extent, and specifically because of my physical characteristics, that I went to teachers for support so many times because I wanted them to address the issues that were happening that were causing such intense psychological damage for me. And the response that I got was that, you know what, you should probably see a counselor. It wasn't that I'm going to address this problem or we're going to actually change the structures of what's happening here. It was, you know, you should probably go see a counselor. And I remember that day very clearly. I remember storming out of that classroom and feeling like nobody in the world understood me. And this is such a common thing that that happens with our youth, where we're told, especially within anti-bullying, look the other way. Tell a teacher about what's going on. And so often, nothing actually happens about the situation. Nothing actually gets changed. And so one thing that I want to touch upon before I jump into is the idea of how the schools fail to center Black contributions, histories, and voices and narratives around curriculum and pedagogy, is that when our youth actually speak up about something, it's because they are taking every ounce of courage to tell you what is happening because they trust you and because they trust you to do something about the problem. And so in touching upon the question that Preet posed, I wanted to share that growing up in Alberta, I didn't learn a single thing about the history of Black communities in this country, and I know that this is very true for a lot of the people living in other provinces, with the exception of Ontario, Nova Scotia, that has a little bit more of a curriculum that focuses on Black history. But this has also come at the advocacy of Black community members that have compiled their own histories and have advocated for decades for this to be included. It didn't just appear in the curriculum out of nowhere. Here in BC, the curriculum has now shifted to give educators freedom to present different perspectives and to focus on bigger ideas and bigger concepts with their students, and to include more Indigenous perspectives, which is a start. And I also wanted to note that even the inclusion of Indigenous perspectives, the little that there is, also happened because of Indigenous communities that organized and that actually advocated for decades at a time for their history to be included. Again, this did not come out of a vacuum. And so related to that is that we have the structure that creates more freedom for teachers to teach from different perspectives, to teach about the histories that makes Canada what it is today, but it also places an impetus on them to educate themselves and be willing to locate resources and materials that offer these alternative narratives. Again, this is going to depend on like the school that you're a part of, the culture of the school, but it also means that there is a responsibility within teachers as well to be sourcing these resources and narratives and to be reading books and to be understanding them, because even in teachers college, rarely is this kind of material taught. And this is a big problem, is that if teachers haven't examined themselves and their worldview, if they haven't deeply understood that the structure that we live in is white supremacy, and as a result that we all exhibit in some capacity characteristics of white supremacist behavior, if they aren't willing to come to that realization and haven't been taught about the missing perspectives that are being actively silenced in Canada, how can we expect that information to suddenly get passed on to kids, right? So this is kind of like a double education within the education system, the education of the educator. And so this is often also what pushed me to do the kind of curriculum that I do with students, whether it be working with Black students, whether it be working with a mixed classroom, is to talk about not only the histories that have happened here, but also to talk about the present and to talk about the future. And to talk about the future as something that is in our hands to shape, especially to give that power to Black students, to be able to have an opportunity to imagine that and to shape that. And this is the basis of what is called Afrofuturism, is to imagine our future from a place of power, according to our self-determination, according to our dignity, and to be able to shape our futures in that way. And this is something that has been taken away from us for so many hundreds of years, and that we really need to be placing that power back in the hands of our Black students. And we also need to be talking about the importance of talking about resistance, right? The importance of talking about what have Black communities achieved to actually fight back the amount of oppression that they have faced living in what we now know as Canada, so-called Canada. And this is really key, because if we teach just the history of oppression, of all the ugly and terrible things that have happened to our communities, which is true and which is important to know about, but we don't actually also teach kids about the things that our communities have done to organize, to actually fight back, then we are teaching essentially a history of like a conquered place, of a conquered narrative. And it is really important for kids, and especially for Black kids, to understand and to know that there is a fierce legacy of resistance that has happened here in so-called Canada, all across Turtle Island, and all across the world, that gives them hope and gives them some resilience to be able to survive the systems that they're currently in. In terms of what the spaces could actually look like, I definitely want to see more Black teachers involved in schools. And that's the main feedback that I often get when I'm in classrooms, is that, you know what, Ruby, you're the first teacher that I've seen who is Black. And it has made such a difference, even just to know that I have somebody else in the school that sees me and understands a part of my identity that other folks don't. As well, I think that Black liberatory spaces can also look like having trauma-informed counselors that are aware and understand white supremacy to a certain extent as best as they can, and understand that racism, that white supremacy plays a huge role in the mental health of our students. So I think it looks like a lot more Black therapists also in schools with those supports. It also looks like inserting materials within the curriculum that talk about all of these histories, but it really, at the root, means a lot more Black communities being consulted around what is happening within the education system, what is happening within the curriculum as well.
Thank you, Ruby. I'll pass that question on to JOANN as well. But I also want to, and it could be in this question and sort of moving forward as well. We are, of course, talking about educators and teachers, but we know that schooling and the institution is also controlled by administrators, from school board trustees, counselors. This conversation is about the whole school community. So just I'm just gonna drop that in for folks because I know that those people are also here, and we need to talk about that part of that power structure as well. Thank you so much, Ruby. I've had Ruby actually in my classes this year, and really can attest to the power of bringing that lens of not just Black history, but futures, not just oppression, but the resistance. We talk a lot about racial progress in Canada as if it just happened. No, it was running along. It was because it was led by folks that are experiencing the oppression. We only get where we get because of that resistance alongside. So JOANN, if you would like to also answer or speak to this question.
No, I'm just going to say +1 to Ruby, because Ruby, you really touched on everything, from the curriculum to having more Black teachers in school. I mean, sometimes I walk through the hallway of certain schools and I see other Black kids. I tell you, that's a space where I'm so elated, because You know, they see me and you see the sparkle in their eyes because there's this, they see an educator, someone who they can connect with, you know. Black History Month, fine, is the month of February, a month designated to teach our history. But why does it have to end there? You know, I admire the new curriculum that talks about indigenous ways of knowing. For me, that's been a big learning process for me. You know, I get to see all of that. But then we also have the Black community. I mean, I know in Nova Scotia during the time of the North movement, we have lots of Black people there. And going through history, I've seen that there's a lot of inventions by Black people in Canada. Why is that not spoken to in science? Why is that not shared in social studies? So I just don't want to see the Black history or the Black study as a one-off thing. It should be infused across subjects, from math to science to social studies to planning. You know, and I love the concept about Afrofuturism. You know, why is it that most people, I mean, I'm not saying don't talk about slavery, but how does slavery start? And where did we get to after slavery? Don't talk to me, don't talk to us about don't look at us from the perspective of oppression, you know, but look at us from the perspective of, okay, we've overcome oppression and we're moving forward. You know, but because people have that mindset of, oh, it's slavery, it's incarceration, is, I mean, they've just been subjected to, you know, poverty, that's where they should stay. That's where they should remain. All of these narratives, all of these voices should change. And as Ruby said, you know, going to meet a counselor or even CHUKA, and then they say go see a counselor, and you're going to see someone who does not know again about your lived experience. What do you say? What will you discuss? And I'm troubled because sometimes I wonder, okay, even for me, there are times I really want to speak to, even as a PhD candidate at UBC, and I want to speak to an instructor, to a prof. I'm busy looking for Black professors across the whole faculty, across the whole university, because I need someone who understands where I'm coming from. If I could do that in a big institution, how much more our kids in high school? Let's recruit more Black counselors. Let's have them in places of leadership. In counselors, teachers, I want to see more people there. And something we could do is have clubs where we have Black kids sharing their ideas. And I'm sure there are some of us here as educators who know so much, especially if you're widely traveled. You might have been to countries in Africa. Africa is a continent, not a country, because that's one narrative, again, we hear all the time. Oh, you're from Africa. No, I'm from the continent of Africa, but I'm from Nigeria in Africa. So if we start unlearning what we've learned and relearn it, that will move us further as educators. That will change the narratives, and that will bring voices. Let's empower the Black kids in our school. They need that support. Because if your voice is heard as an educator in school, our children love us. A child listens first to an educator before they listen to their parents. It's what the educator says that is they hold to high esteem. And imagine where a child is haunted, or it's sent away by an educator. Oh, you know what? I can't deal with this. Go speak to someone else. That child leaves you more depressed. The child wants to hear from you. The child wants to connect with you. So I think as educators, we should have Prodi days talking about the culture, the narratives, the structure, the well-being, the curriculum. There's so much you need to know. Egyptian revolution, Black power, Afrofuturism, Black power revolution, you know, the slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade. You know, we have ancestors who've done so well in Africa. We talk about Mansa Musa, we talk about Queen Amina, we talk about Alexander the Great. So many of those guys from Africa. Then they get to see that, you know what, don't see yourself from the place of oppression. See yourself from a place that you're going to move on to the next level.
And Preet, if I may, I just wanted to add one thing to JOANN's point around Black clubs and students organizing, is that an amazing initiative happened out at LA Matheson School in Surrey, where I believe it was last year, the students themselves actually organized a Black student union, and they were able to actually have a space that was supported by one Black teacher there as well, that actually provided them space to allow them to talk about what's happening in their lives and actually make events happen that brought attention to their experience as Black students, and according to their own narratives that were so unique, Black students coming from all different parts of the diaspora. So I just wanted to give a shout out to that and insert that possibility in to potentially happen in other schools as well.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you for sharing that, Ruby. I appreciate that you folks are really just being very upfront about what is needed. You know, not just infusing all this into the curriculum, but like, we need Black teachers. We need Black counselors. It has to be more than just not those of us that are not Black supporting Black students. Of course, that's critical. So I really do appreciate that lens. I'm gonna have one final question before our break, which is at 11:45. So my apologies, it's gonna be a bit of a short response from CHUKA and then Ruby, but we can pick it up after the 5-minute break. So let me just figure out which one I wanted. So much of Canadian popular culture, media, music, sports, etc., is influenced by the US. In fact, it seems like we have an obsession with focusing on the US, whether it's from racial violence to our entertainment consumption. Our lives are deeply informed by African American culture. So this is a two-pronged question. One is, what are the layers of harm that occur when we consume Black culture while disconnecting from our own behavior of colorism and anti-Blackness? And this particular piece really rings true for me as a South Asian woman, being in communities of color that are constantly consuming Blackness, but not real, and then also perpetrating colorism. And the second part is, there is a sharp focus on US politics and racial violence, but many Canadians use this as a way to look away from the very real violence and erasure that Black bodies and communities endure here in Canada. So I would like for you folks to speak to this sort of willful ignorance and how it affects education. So perhaps I'll give Ruby a little bit of a break and we'll start with CHUKA first.
Thank you, Preet, and thank you, Ruby and JOANN, for the things that for the comments that you just made. I want to quickly say that you know, you'll have historians who can tell you, who can teach you, who can speak for millennia about the history of the world, but don't know a thing about pre-colonial societies in sub-Saharan Africa. So it is definitely an issue. So yeah, so this question definitely is one that's quite expensive. So I might go a bit quickly. In the first aspect, in terms of like consuming Blackness, but then perpetrating colorism and anti-Blackness. I think that like in one sense it's like worth speaking with care here, because I'm you know, wary of essentializing African American identity, but certainly it is worth noting that the kind of adoption, co-optation, and presentation of sort of African American presenting or sort of Black presenting or Black coded aspects of self-presentation or manners of speech or aesthetic sensibilities and whatnot is incredibly ubiquitous. It's something that is kind of just sort of culturally recognized as being desirable, and so is sort of adopted and pursued by people in innumerable ways, in innumerable spaces, and in innumerable mediums, but then is completely separated from the people who produce, sort of produce these aesthetic or cultural artifacts, and in many ways, the people who adopt them can then use them to generate profit, of course, without any of the kind of recognition or profit returning to, or proceeds returning to the communities that actually produce these like sort of aesthetic or cultural artifacts. I think, you know, one of the most immediately available examples of this is sort of hip hop culture, which is something that is, of course, sort of grounded in the African American experience and with historical legacies to sub-Saharan African cultures and music, but is sort of grounded in the African American experience, generated by African American communities, but then now is kind of has been sort of, you know, the term culture vulture comes to mind, where people will sort of extract from it what they wish and use those things that they've extracted from it, separated entirely from the context that produced it, from the political and social and economic context that produced it, and then use that to generate profit without a thought for what the kind of the moral or political valences of those actions actually are. And it's one, it's incredibly distressing, but then the other side, I think, is that, again, these are, when people do that, they are choosing an identity, whereas in many cases, Black people are either expected to conform to that identity, or if they don't, will experience, again, like harassment and ridicule for not conforming to that identity. And that is, I think, the other side of it, that there is that in the creation, in the process of self-actualization that people go through their lives, Black people seem to have such like a particularly Black people in the quote unquote West, have such a limited amount of space in which they can exist without being harassed or ridiculed or being accused of not being Black. Whereas other people can kind of select whatever they wish. And so when you select these things, you're, I think, either ignorant of that fact or willfully callous to it. And then the other aspect that you mentioned, Preet, about focusing on the U.S., I think that there's again two kind of two consequences to this. The first being that, of course, it ends up with people ignoring the anti-Black history of this land, which includes 200 years of slavery, which includes structural marginalization, includes exploitation and subjugation, includes roving gangs of violent white supremacists, includes lynchings, includes minstrel shows, and continues to this day. For example, I don't know that it's commonly known that BC has the highest rate of deadly police interactions of any subnational jurisdiction in this country, and I don't think it's widely known that the Manitoba or the Winnipeg Police Service, their SWAT teams have up to 3,000 annual deployments. So these are things that are present here, but we look to the U.S. and often obfuscate what's happening here. Then the other thing, if I may very quickly, is that the U.S. sort of this kind of self-propagated narrative of the United States, even when it considers things like anti-Black racism, is very very muted, and it does not. I don't think it earnestly reflects on and discusses the degree to which violent white supremacy was an animating force of political institutions in the country and continues to be. It's not. I don't think it's often discussed that like law enforcement in the U.S. ordered and orchestrated the assassination of Black political figures up until the 60s and 70s, and it is. So I think that by looking at issues in the U.S., both do we attempt to obfuscate what happens here, but then also we accept the kind of whitewashed, for lack of a better term, narrative of what actually occurred in the U.S. without digging into the true sort of brutality that occurred. Like lynchings were considered family events. People would, without speaking with and apologies for the graphic nature of this comment, but people who were lynched, they would be hanged, they would be burned, they would be mutilated, and pieces of their body would be handed out to people who would come, including children who would take them home as souvenirs. These were animating elements of America, of the culture of the United States, and continue to be animating mechanisms in the way political systems and institutions and jurisdictions operate. And so I think that both we ignore what's happening here and we don't actually understand what happened there.
Thank you so much, CHUKA. I appreciate you're trying to get everything in there too, and I apologize. I should have also noted I can push the break a little bit to give everyone ample time to respond, but very great points. I don't know if anyone out there has heard of Dr. Cheryl Thompson. You were speaking about minstrel shows, but there's a fantastic interview with her on Canada Land around the time where all the images came out with Justin Trudeau's multiple Black and brown faces, about 2 centuries of blackface in Canada. Absolutely fascinating work that everyone needs to take a look at. So I'm going to pass this on to Ruby. Please do take your time, and we'll take the break whenever you feel that you're completed. And CHUKA, if there's anything else you want to add after, just please let me know. Okay, Ruby.
Thank you, CHUKA. Really laid it down there. I have very little to add, I think, and you covered most of it. But I just wanted to say that I think in general and around the world, we have this issue where it's so much easier to criticize what's happening in other countries than to criticize what's happening in our own. And I've been seeing this in the last week, staying with my mom here. She's from the Chilean end of things, and we've been watching the protests that have been broadcasted every single night on Chilean television and talking about the issue of police brutality, of police violence against Black communities in the United States in particular. And for me, it was, breathtaking to see that this was getting covered on an international level. Yet to also contrast that with what was happening in Chile at that same point in time, which was the violent killing of a Mapuche indigenous community member in the south of Chile. That was not broadcasted. That was not broadcasted that once they had killed him, they made his child walk 10 kilometers back to his own community. And so it's so easy to look at the violence that is happening in other countries, but not look at the violence that is happening in your own, because we don't want to have to look at ourselves, because it forces us to also look at ourselves and look at how we are also participating within that system of violence. And I think that is the key thing that a lot of people forget. And this in Canada, I think, is a very specific dynamic where we brand ourselves as a multicultural society. We brand and advertise or travel advertisements towards, look at all the culture that we have. Isn't it nice? Come here, experience it. But we don't actually talk about what is the experience that is being had by people that belong to that culture. How are they being exploited for the culture that they produce? And in Canada in particular, this is an age-old problem. And Robin Maynard in her recent book, Policing Black Lives, talks about how Canadians in the 1930s were polled about the racial tension that was happening and the Negro problem that was happening in the United States. And people, Canadians, responded that they thought that was horrible what was happening, what was going on, that they were grateful that this wasn't present in Canada. And they went a step further to say that they, in order to avoid such a problem that was happening in the United States, that it would be best to actually not have Black people in Canada, because then you wouldn't have a Negro problem. And you wouldn't have the kind of events that were happening in the United States. So really interesting how even back in the 1930s, we still had that contradiction of, you know, thinking that we didn't have that problem. And again, the limiting of Black communities and their participation in public space in our society, how is fundamental to also that stream of thought. And that's kind of also how we end up where we are today, where everybody wants to consume Black music, Black art, Black hair, Black bodies, but nobody actually wants the lived experience of being Black. And the thing is that art or resistance, everything that comes out of our experiences, comes out of pain, comes from writing songs, creating art, to send a message to the world around what is happening, to be able to process what is happening in our lives. And this just gets consumed. And what gets consumed is the cool aspects, the aesthetic aspects that the Black community produces, the culture that it produces, the Black communities produce, I should say. And nobody wants to talk also about the capitalism specifically that exploits Black labor, Black music, Black culture, and Black life, and also the aspect of how capitalism is so deeply connected to racism, and specifically anti-Black racism. And it's also capitalism which draws out what we create and doesn't actually compensate, and has never actually compensated us for our labor, for our art, for our brilliance, whether we're talking about here in so-called Canada or in the so-called United States, or many places across the world as well.
Thank you so much, Ruby. So well said. Chuka, is there anything you wanted to add before we take a break? Okay, excellent, thank you. It reminds me, and I don't, forgive me, I don't remember who quoted it, but the idea that I wish America loved Black people as much as they love Black culture, or, you know, replace America with really almost any part of the planet. And I think it still stands. So thank you very much, folks. We are going to take a 5-minute breather so everyone can walk, use the bathroom, do what you need to do, and we'll return for the final portion of our panel and event today. So we'll see you folks in 5. Welcome back. I'm just going to wait here a second to make sure that all our panelists are back as well before I start. I see JOANN, I see CHUKA, and I will see, oh, and there is Ruby. Okay, folks, hope you enjoyed some Lizzo, got a little bit of a stretch. We are nearing the end of our panel today. We have about 30 minutes, and we have had a lot of questions coming in from, oh, Jeremy's camera is on. A lot of questions coming in from participants. So we have narrowed it down to just a couple right now because we're running out of time. So I'm going to ask this of all panelists, and I will start sort of left to right. So it'll go JOANN, CHUKA, and Ruby first. The question is, there are a lot of decision makers in the room right now, the sort of virtual room. What are some effective, concrete actions that policymakers, school board members, and union leaders can take to immediately address racism in our schools? So I'll let that sort of percolate for a second, although I'm sure you have many ideas already. So let me pass it first to JOANN.
Thank you, and thanks for the person who asked that question. You know, number one, what we're doing here now is the first action, getting educators to listen to us. The second one is, I think the immediate action is let's have professional development for teachers now. You know, I know it's not possible due to the COVID and due to lack, but something can happen in the month of August, in the month of September. We could actually have virtual workshops now on talking about what is it being Black, how do you interact, how do you connect with Black kids in your school, what are the things you need to know. That's the hidden curriculum component. And then the short-term or long-term goal, I know it takes a while for curriculum to be redesigned, you know, then we can start thinking of how to infuse. Even though we have school principals here who can, even during staff meeting, can ask teachers, okay, depending on the topic, you know, we have our autonomy. We have the agency in our classrooms. You can encourage teachers in schools now to include certain topics within the topic to teach about Black history, Black culture, Black innovation. Just talk about us, talk about our history, talk about well-being. Another thing we could have is let's have people in power, people in leadership. I'm not sure if, I don't know, but I can't say, but I'm not sure if there's any Black person, Black school principal in the whole of BC or in the whole of Canada. I'm not sure. Do we have anybody in our school authority, in the school board, in the BCTF? Is there anybody representing someone of my color, someone, an indigenous person, or someone representing people of color? Is there someone there who can speak our voice, who can tell you what you need to hear? Because one thing is, you know, I mean, looking at all the protests, I see all the other people coming out protesting, coming out with parades, and I wonder, are you trying to become our allies? And then at the end of the day, this thing dies down, you throw down all the policies under your table, and you walk away pretending as if though nothing happened. Let's go into action now, not just today, but now. Let's have people of color, teachers, school leaders in leadership, and school counselors. And most importantly is, what's the retainership of Black teachers? Because I could just be in school, after 3 years, you surplus me. I'm not sure, I mean, I can't say this is what has happened, but how many Black teachers are still retained back? I'm sure we have people coming out from teacher education program. How many of those Black teachers do you want to keep in the school district that can now be the faces, can be the voices that can change the narratives within the school system, that can become mentors to our kids? And I want to also see, like Ruby said, the school that's in Surrey, I want school leaders to facilitate Black Students Union in schools now. At least that is the basic thing we need to do now. You know, and it's not about, okay, let's do it here, let's do it. And then you say, yes, it's okay. But then you ignore us down the line, because I see a lot of write-ups now, and I'm troubled because those write-ups could just be patronizing me. And then when you say, oh, this is what we've done, and then when I call you to have a conversation, you're like, oh, JOANN, it's fine, you know, and that's it. Thank you.
Wow, thank you, JOANN. So powerful. I think you're speaking a little bit to that the notion of the tyranny of incrementalism, right? Just little bits of moving forward when the demand is always power, decision-making power, and beyond what we're seeing everywhere right now from all institutions, statements of solidarity, but then nothing leading up to it. And
if I have to add to that, one thing is having a Black person in leadership and also giving the person a voice. You know, because you can be in leadership and not have a voice.
Mm-hmm.
That's very, very critical, you
Mm-hmm.
know? Yeah. I'm sure Chuka and Ruby has more to add to this. Yeah.
Okay, let's move on along then to Chuka.
So first of all, I absolutely endorse and support everything that JOANN mentioned. You know, Ruby also earlier in their conversation made a lot of suggestions for how schools can be more hospitable to Black students and how if experiences of racism are raised, how they should be addressed. So I absolutely support those as well. In regards to concrete steps, this is a bit of a tricky question for me for two reasons. The first being that, like, I myself am not directly an educator, so I feel it's important to recognize that. But then also that sort of the notion of like addressing racism, it's like, well, I mean, if you were to ask how do you address racism in society, and I think that it's difficult to separate racism from society, right? It is like a fundamental element of it. And so I think the thing that I would argue for is sort of like a method of evaluation, whether you're evaluating curricula, evaluating disparities that exist in your school in regards to, like, you know, discipline and punishment, or the sort of different academic streams that students take, or the amount of resources that students directly have access to. I would argue for a sort of method of evaluation, and one that is sort of based in a particular notion of kind of recognizing where things come from. You know, the world that we inhabit in many ways is kind of structured by and a reflection of Eurocentric extractive capitalism, right? And so that's fundamentally sort of a white supremacist socioeconomic structure. And within that structure, one of the primary logics of it, as Ruby mentioned earlier, is the sort of principle that Black people are not human and that are beasts that have to be controlled and civilized most frequently through violence. And so, you know, that remains, whether you know, most, like, implicitly often, but at times explicitly, that remains embedded in the system, and then the system sort of structures the institutions that we still inhabit. And so I think that I would kind of argue for a method of evaluation that kind of recognizes the sort of historical legacies that kind of developed and animate the institutions that we live within and live with, and the principles that are embedded in those systems and in those legacies, and then through that recognition evaluates the things that we are currently propagating or currently employing, with an attempt to quell those impulses. That's what I would say.
Thank you, Chuka. And finally, Ruby.
Thank you. I would also like to uplift and support the suggestions made by JOANN and CHUKA as well. I think I'll just add on to it in terms of, you know, we can't talk about like ending racism within our schools without talking about the overrepresentation of youth and adults in prison, not only in BC, but overall across the country. And this is usually on par with Indigenous communities as well. We can't talk about it without talking about and naming the overrepresentation of Black individuals in carding practices and racial profiling practices as well, all of which are practices in policing, or that in BC, as Chuka mentioned, we have the highest number of police-involved deaths. And so further to that, I think we really need to examine the role of school liaison programs, school resource officer programs, where we have officers in the place of schools, and really talk about redirecting the funding that goes to those programs towards Black and Indigenous community-based initiatives, whether that looks like Pro-D days, whether it looks like hiring more trauma-informed counselors, mental health supports, addiction supports for youth. All of those things are ways that community-based initiatives could really benefit from. I also want to specifically talk about, you know, larger structures and systems honestly suck at getting feedback, at getting critique. And I think as individuals, we do too. We often see it as like, oh no, it's the fault. I have to hide that. I have to cover it. I don't want to look at that part of myself. And it's really important that we look at why, right? If I'm driving down the highway, my car's on fire, or my engine's smoking, and I haven't noticed, and someone smokes or points it out and tells me that, I'm not going to get mad at them for pointing out that my car's on fire. And right in the education system, in some aspects, we do have a burning car situation. And so we really need to talk about, you know, ending practices where, you know, students that speak out against racism potentially get silenced or get ignored or dismissed, or where teachers, you know, may also be experiencing this, where they provide feedback to administration, to their larger schooling institutions around what is going on within the schools, and also might get silenced or might face repercussions around speaking out, we really need to look at that aspect, because otherwise we can't create those changes if we're not willing to accept the feedback from people that are experiencing it and that are seeing it and that are on the ground with it. So offering our listening ears, but also protection for folks that are coming forward and talking about those really important issues that literally are about protecting and centering the life of Black and Indigenous communities. In addition, I think Pro-D Days are awesome. I really agree with JOANN's point that we really need to be engaging in this ongoing process around learning about Black histories, Black resilience, Black brilliance, and also specifically engaging in anti-racist training. It's not enough to just say that we're not racist. It's really about an ongoing practice that we all have to take part and engage in, because this is lifelong work. We've been living in white supremacy and in capitalism, and there are certain behaviors that get ingrained in us that we sometimes don't even realize. And that's okay, but we also need to acknowledge it, accept it, and work on moving on from that and addressing the systemic harms that have been caused and that are causing harms to our students. And again, this is all in light of framing the well-being, framing the survival, framing the thrival of students in the school system. You know, we don't want to have to be in a position where, you know, our students are dropping out, our students are feeling like they are not worth anything because these systems are failing them. We want to be the best that we can for our students, and this involves that hard work. This involves that hard, critical look at ourselves and our practices and what we're doing. That, yeah, might involve some apologies, might involve looking at these structures fundamentally that may have not been changed in decades, but really around centering the well-being and self-determination and the survival of Black and Indigenous youth in particular.
Thank you very much, Ruby. I had heard this really great, again, interview with Ibram X. Kendi. I mean, his work and everything he's been doing has really transformed my thinking about racial justice. But he was asked, what is the best advice he's ever been given? And he said to be able to distinguish between constructive and destructive criticism. Both of them will hurt, but one of them will actually push you to start actually doing some action and growing and learning and moving along, sort of what you're speaking about in terms of, you know, your car is on fire. That's a constructive criticism that you need to hear right now, versus thinking that you were being blamed for having the car on fire in the first place. Also, I like to, you know, this has been brought up a few times with all of the facilitators around dropping out for Black students and youth. And I really love the reframing of it as pushing out. Right? What are the ways that the system actually pushes out Black students, not that they choose to leave? So this, you know, Ruby, you kind of touched on it already, but I think it's worth sort of returning to this, this question that was posed by someone here in the chat, which is that teachers replicate colonial practices. 100%. We have to acknowledge that we are very powerful, right? And anyone who sort of dismisses the power of teachers is not really understanding how education really works. So the question is, how can white liberal teachers interrogate their biases? So perhaps I'll move in a different order just to break it up. We'll start with CHUKA, if you don't mind. And yeah, we'll get started, and then we'll go JOANN and then, or sorry, yeah, JOANN and then Ruby.
Yeah, well, I think that one thing that could be done is starting with the recognition that the types of knowledge or quote unquote performance or academic achievement that are venerated by our prevailing educational institutions are not only the systems of knowledge or knowledge production or sharing or again, quote unquote performance or achievement that exists in the world, and that, you know, the ones that we've chosen to venerate in our educational institutions are very specific and in many cases impositional, and often kind of devalue other systems of other systems of knowledge, other understandings of the world in ways that are you know very can be very harmful. And so I think sort of attempting to learn, first of all, attempting to learn about those other systems of knowledge, systems, means of understanding the world is very, I think, very important. For example, this is something that I learned not all that long ago, is that there's the exact name of it escapes me at the moment, but there's this sort of West African system of or means of understanding history is cyclical. So rather than the trajectory of history being linear and sort of almost teleological, and that, you know, everything everything that is in the past is fundamentally in the past, and while it may inform things that occur now, it is still something that occurred in the past. It is instead that everything that happened in the past is also concurrent and recurring. That experiences that the way that past experiences or past events inform the present is by existing alongside them. And so in the present, you are also still in the past, and those experiences are kind of within you and thus are recurring. And so, I mean, I think I think it's sort of just on its face rather compelling, but then also I think it changes the way that we understand interactions between you know, sort of quote unquote past events and the present, and therefore it changes the way that we can think about how things can be addressed, because path dependency is often sort of put forward as something that is incredibly limiting in terms of the capacity for political or structural change. But if the past is not in the past, right, if it is kind of concurrent with the present, then path dependency can be considered in a very different way. And so I think that was something that I would put forward, is kind of recognizing and learning about different systems of knowledge.
Thank you, Chuka. JOANN.
I'm emotional now because I know it takes a lot for you to change what someone's mindset and how someone sees the other person, you know? As an educator, a question I would like to throw on to everyone: what do you learn? What do you study? Is it just your knowledge, your content, your subject matter, or do you read vast and do you read wide? For example, if you have 10 kids coming into your classroom and we say Canada is multicultural, what do you know about each individual child? Once you're able to understand, you know, we talk about class profiling all the time. Now speaking as a special educator, you know, class profiling in the sense that how many kids are on an IEP. But now let's juxtapose this to racism, or to race, or to gender, you know, or to their lived experience. What do you know about each individual child? Once you get to that point, your bias reduces. You throw away your bias because now it's not just about what you think you know about the Black person. It's what do you think you know about JOANN that comes into play. Because as an educator, sometimes, I mean, I still remember a relationship or a conversation I had with someone in 2013. This was my classmate in my master's class. And this person made a statement. He said, oh, if I see any Black child, I will know this child is a refugee. That struck me because are you saying if you see my own son in your class, the first thing you think is, my son is a refugee? He said, yes, but aren't all Black kids refugees in Canada? Wow. So again, as teachers, we need to unlearn what we know. Go and read more. Read about, I mean, I came into Canada and the first thing I studied was indigenous ways of, I needed to know the land. I needed to know the people. So when I go into a class, I know how to interact with all my students. I don't want to walk with them based on the notion and the conversation I've heard. So we need to change the way we access knowledge, the way we process information, you know, and that way as teachers, once we're able to do that, once there's that shift in the way we think, in our mindset, in our biases, we're able to interact with our kids as individuals, not based on the preconceived notion you have about that child. Yeah.
Thank you, JOANN. Next is Ruby.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that I think a lot of this work requires this deep examination of who we are. We can't pretend that, you know, who we are as individuals, the identities that we have, the experiences that we've gone through don't also filter our way of seeing the world and don't filter themselves into the classroom. And in that light, that deep introspective work is lifelong work, right? You know, even within myself, where I give anti-oppression workshops, I can't say that I'm anti-oppressed. There are still behaviors and things inside me that I know that I need to work on and that I know is going to take lifelong work. And so that really involves like looking at yourself deeply of like, what has shaped my experiences? How did I grow up? What did I grow up knowing as truth? What books do I read? Who are those books written by? What music do I consume? Who are those lyrics? Who is that music produced by? What events do I go to? Where do I feel comfortable? And what events do I surround myself by? And looking at your friends, your friend circle, who are my friend groups, right? Whose knowledge informs my knowledge, my circle, my well-being, my family. All of these things are questions that require deep examination as to what we're surrounding ourselves by and how we're being influenced by those messages, and also requires a conscious shift into shifting into ways where, you know, I might read a book by Angela Davis, I might read a book by James Baldwin, but I might also go to a cultural event from a different community that isn't mine, to be able to understand and experience that culture in a different light, to be able to understand that in a more intimate way, and not just in a way that is, you know, from an academic perspective or a banking method of education given to me, memorized, and then, you know, something that I rehearse back at people. It has to be something that is innate and that is embedded within your own practice and your own way of being. It requires a shift of being.
Thank you, Ruby. Sorry, someone's voice sort of popped in at the end, so that threw me off a little bit. Were you finished?
I think that was mostly it. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Folks, thank you. We are nearing the end. We're going to start closing it up pretty soon. But I wanted to just go through the panelists one last time, just to share your final thoughts, whatever that is. It could be as brief as you want or as long as you want. Something that you want everyone to leave. I mean, folks have, yeah, I mean, everything you said, I think there's so much for us to sort of like mull over and think about and reflect on. But I just want to be able to give you that opportunity to close for yourselves and for all of our hundreds of participants that are here. So I will go back to JOANN and just ask for any closing remarks you would like to make.
Yeah, I started with a poem, and I'm also going to end with 2 poems, you know, because again, it's been my healing process in the past 1 month. You know, and the first one is the beauty of color. You know, we keep on saying people of color, but the beauty of color: black, blue, yellow, green, orange, purple. What's in the color? Why refer to me as a person of color? What makes your color different from mine? Look around you. My color makes the world complete. I exist because I am black. They say black is beauty. I exist because I'm white. They say white adds brightness. Beauty and brightness coexist. To make the world a better place for my children and grandchildren to live, color sure adds beauty to the world. Therefore, we are all people of color. And the second poem is Walking on Pebbles. Looking at the horizon, seeing pebbles of different sizes and shapes. Desire to walk on each one, savoring each step along the way. Small, big, medium, stable, wobbly, unstable, tilted. The journey of a lifetime begins, guarded with my loins, ready to embark on this trek. Step 1, not so bad. Step 2, oops, this is wobbly. Step 3, I can't stand on my 2 feet. Then I find my balance. Look back at the past. Peep around the now. Stare wide into the future. Hold my hands. Don't let me stumble. Don't let the ground swallow my being. Help! Why didn't you tell me? The road will not be easy. It's a rough path. The journey is not smooth. Stones haul at me, water gushing through my feet. At last, I find peace. In the sound of silence, the sound of birds chirping, telling me, trudge on, walk strong, stand high, walk each pebble one step at a time. Thank you.
Thank you, JOANN. The way you completed that full circle is profound. Beautiful. Thank you so much. CHUKA.
Thank you. In my final remarks, I would just like to express gratitude to both JOANN and Ruby for everything that you've said today. Specifically, JOANN, I want to thank you for sharing the conversations that you've had with your children and your experiences as a disability advocate. I really appreciate both. I really appreciate that you were willing to share both of those things. And Ruby, for your discussion of internalized white supremacy, including among Black people, to both of you, I really admire and appreciate the vulnerability that you showed, and I sort of aspire to that same level. So thank you both. And then Preet and Shani, thank you for bringing us together for this conversation, and I'm grateful to have been able to participate in it.
Thank you for participating as well, Chuka. We really, really appreciate it. And finally, Ruby.
Thank you so much for organizing and for putting this together. Thank you as well to JOANN and for CHUKA for sharing your wisdom. I learned so much from you two today. I wanted to close and leave everyone with just this notion of that our memory can also be used as a weapon. And in times where we as Black community members have witnessed the death of community members for hundreds of years, for decades at a time, over and over again, and let us not forget these names that have left us too soon. Let us not forget that these mobilizations are happening right now, and let them not dissolve in your mind's eye after 2 weeks, after the media has turned their attention from them. We have to remember this moment. We have to remember George Floyd. We have to remember the rebellions that are happening in the name of George Floyd and so many others that have passed in the last 2 weeks. And we also have to remember that we now have a commitment and a responsibility, now that we know, to continue this work within ourselves, within our classrooms, within our school systems, within our families, within our communities, so that this never happens again. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruby. I want to just express a sincere recognition and the deepest gratitude to all of our panelists for your time, your energy, your labor, your vulnerability on this Saturday, a weekend. I know that already JOANN is off to another interview right after this. The work just never stops, and we recognize that work is burden often on people of color and Black folks. So thank you so much for coming. I'm thinking of George Sefadeh, the anti-racism educator, who says anti-racism is moving from the rhetoric to action. So I really do hope that all of the folks that have tuned in today are leaving with some actionable pieces. And the other one, I love this quote as well from, again, Kendi, who says that knowledge is only power if knowledge is put to the struggle for power. Changing minds is not a movement. Critiquing racism is not activism. So I know there's a lot of folks here that do see themselves as activists, and an activist produces power and policy change, not mental change. So just something for folks to leave with. I would like to pass the mic back to Shani for the final closing remarks. Thank you so much, everybody, and thank you for allowing me to sort of bumble through as the first time moderating this new platform. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. A heartfelt thank you to our panelists. You led us through some very moving and necessary conversation in a way in which we all have avenues and intersections into the work. And we just have a deep and immense gratitude for that. You know, one of the things that I hear often from educators in all capacities in the province is that when we're looking at anti-racism and racism, it's heavy, and that this work is often scary and uncomfortable. But what I know doing this work and watching my Black students feel so empowered to be in the skin that they are and acknowledge it, is that this work is so uplifting. Anti-racist work is good work, and it's work that we all need to engage in. And I just want to say thank you so much to our panelists for helping us navigate this issue in this way in which we all are so empowered. Thank you to Preet, our moderator. I know she termed herself as bumbling, but that was anything but. And you just did a great job of making sure we all understood what these panelists were saying by highlighting the key concepts. So thank you so much for that work. Our organization, the Anti-Oppression Educators Collective, you can find our website at www.aoec.ca. We will link this recording of this town hall. As well, we have a number of resources. For all of those that have attended this town hall, you will get an email with our resource page. And we will also send our website. If you go to the Become a Member section, you can join our PSA in that section, and it will link you to how to do that. I want to also give a lot of gratitude to the folks that helped make this panel happen. And that is Corrine Ning, Preet Litter, Denise Ferreira, Susan Ruzick, Oliver Collar, and Avneet Panu. These folks came together in the last 2 weeks and helped put this town hall on. And as educators in the K-12 system, I know many of us are struggling at the end of the year, especially in this pandemic. And I just want to say, the way we make this work move forward is by the community that we surround ourselves with. And I am so grateful to our AOEC community. I would also like to thank Sarita Lopez and Sarah Labrash. Sarita was so instrumental in helping us with the graphics and publicity for this event, and Sarah for all your tech support. It means so much. It's Saturday. I hope everybody can get out there for some sunshine if it is around, and just know that our organization is here to continue this conversation and that we would like to invite you to our future events. Please check our website out. And thank you so much for all of you that have joined us today. And thank you to our panelists. We are indebted.
If you ever lay awake at night, wondering if we'll be alright, I'm on your side. I'm on your side. If you're sitting at kitchen table, counting up your bills to pay, I'm on your side. I'm on your side. If you drop the kids at school and wonder if they'll make it home today, I'm on your side. I'm on your side. If you're staring at the TV stations, wondering how we got this way, I'm on your side. I'm on your side. Can you hear me? Is your heart beating like a drum? Can you hear me? I don't care where you come from, I am on your